Fellows, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome today on this extremely chilly day in central London. I think John has basically given the nucleus of my lecture, so I am a specialist in Chinese art, but I'm particularly interested in Chinese export art. And therefore my talk today is really going to be about Chinese art objects, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the context in which they were generated, the way in which they arrived in Europe, and indeed the effect they had in Europe. Because that's I've always found fascinating, the way in which the West and the East have combined, essentially for commercial reasons, to generate an export trade, the so-called China trade, which for 300 years has greatly enlivened interior decoration in Europe and indeed the way that polite society behaved. So to talk about objects like this splendid pair of 18th century Chinese porcelain birds mounted on wonderful French 18th century ormolu bases in the way that Westerners did with Chinese things very often when they arrived. But it's also about the history, the context that these objects arrived. How did they get here? Why did they come? Which were the European nations which particularly drove this fascination with the vision of Cathay? It already began here in the 17th century, as I'll be showing you, when the Dutch first began to make major inroads into trading with Asia after the Catholic nation had left it. So it began in Europe. It began either in the mouth of the estuary of the River Rai in Amsterdam or on the waterfront in London, and it ended up here on the waterfront in Canton, where in this case the Dutch and the English hongs, the factories as they were called, the entrepôts where Westerners were based, would do the trading in the late autumn months every year to load the ships coming back to Europe with the trophies of their trade, the teas, the silks, the spices, the porcelain, the lacquer, and indeed the fans. It's a historical story there about Asia, but it begins before the involvement of China. During the medieval period, the trade with Turkey was particularly important. In 1604, when the Somerset House Conference was held in London, commemorating the end of the 20 Years' War between Spain and Britain, when they met on the 16th of August, it wasn't Chinese porcelain or Chinese works of art they used to decorate their room as the centerpiece of their commemorative painting. It was a table carpet, one of the dramatic and expensive statements of power which the objects from outside Europe meant at that time. The early years of the China trade are about power, whether it's dressing a magnificent room, like in this case at Ham House with a Chinese export lacquer cabinet, piling porcelain on top of it, moving again along in the tradition of Baroque decoration, the bright, imposing, ponderous decoration of an essentially masculine society at the highest level in the 16th century, or moving on in later years to the extraordinary aberrations of royalty when George IV, as Prince Regent, created the single greatest surviving example of chinoiserie in Europe, of course, the Brighton Pavilion, which was essentially built by him during his years as Prince of Regent, and at a time when chinoiserie had reached its apogee and was rapidly moving toward its nadir. So my talk today is essentially a historical talk about the way in which the West began to have an influence on the East. And surprisingly, therefore, my talk doesn't begin. My talk doesn't begin with an English factory or with a Dutchman. It begins in Macau with the Portuguese, because the early years of the China trade, when the first things began to come in during the first half of the late second half of the 16th century, was a period dominated by the Portuguese and the Spanish in Asia, by the Catholic nations, the Western ones, particularly the Protestant ones of Britain and Holland, were not yet sufficiently powerful to have actually made an impression on the trading routes established by the Portuguese and the Spanish particularly from their base in Luzon in the Philippines, and the Portuguese in their fixed base on the island of Macau. Here is the Praia Grande, as it's known, where for 400 years they would trade in a rather dilatory sort of way Asian works of art back to Europe. The Spanish, though, were the ones who first began to get in touch with those manufacturers who could produce them specific works of art tailored for a Western market. And in many ways, the most interesting part of the China trade and the objects I'll be looking at today are things which are not just Chinese, but things which do have a Western element in them. In this case, you can see this is a handsome late 17th century Chinese porcelain vase. But what is particularly interesting about it is that in the centre of it is a very visibly European coat of arms. It's actually the arms of Leon and Castile, the arms of the Spanish royal family in the late 16th century. Because this piece was commissioned by, no doubt, a trader based essentially in the Philippines, but commissioned from Jingdezhen, the porcelain capital of China, to be sent back, probably as a presentation piece for a senior member of society, by someone based in the Philippines trying to ingratiate themselves with the Spanish court, the Spanish royal family. This fascination with objects at the highest level is what really influenced the manufacture of works of art. At the beginning, many of them were presentation pieces, ambassadorial pieces, pieces commissioned essentially to influence monarchs in the West by the companies trading in Asia to continue the basis. It was the Catholics who were the key early elements, really, and that's because the British and the Dutch, as many of you will be fully aware, were at a perpetual state of warfare, really, in the 17th century, not merely in the West, but also in Asia. It took a series of defeats of the Catholic nations in the late 17th century to give the Dutch in particular the opportunity to establish themselves as major trading powers in the East. And once they'd done that, the whole nature of the trade changed. Initially, the Spanish material, for example, bought in Canton, had been shipped back through their possessions in Acapulco and through Mexico. The Portuguese ones came back to the west, but were often distributed through Spain, as at the time Spain was in control of Portugal. It ruled it for 60 years in the late 16th and early 17th century. But when the Dutch took over by sheer brute force in Asia, running the inter-island trading from the beginning of the 17th century, and then finally beginning to send merchant ships in large quantities, it was then that the Protestant nations established the stranglehold over the trade, over the China trade, which would dominate it for the period of my central talk, 1600 to about 1850. It was the Dutch, and particularly the British, who sent out most ships every year to be moored downriver in the Pearl River estuary, here in the last deep water anchorage called Whampoa Anchorage, 13 miles downstream, from which the ships would send up their smaller, shallower craft to do the purchasing at the hongs, and the 13 miles downriver, these little boats borne in front would bring the teas, the silks, the spices, the porcelain to be loaded at Whampoa Anchorage onto the Western merchant ships as they sat there having been cleaned, ready for the trip back. By the time that the Dutch and the British took over from the Catholic nations, it was becoming a very, very commercial business in Asia itself, even to the extent of minting their own coins. This porcelain plate, as you can see, which dates from the early 18th century, is actually copying one of the Dutch coins coined in 1728 for the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. You can see their monogram at the bottom of the dish below their coat of arms, because the trade was so well established and so widely established that having their own coinage based in Asia was a benefit. But it was interesting and amusing to have one of the coins copied onto a piece of porcelain to send back to Europe as an example of what the Chinese could do if they were given a Western object to copy, whether it was furniture or a coin or even a painting. My talk is really about works of art, but we must never forget the fact that, of course, the China trade is really about something completely different. The China trade is about tea. The emergence of tea as the key element, the key financial, commercial, profit-rearing element of the entire China trade is sometimes forgotten about when one looks at wonderful pictures of porcelain and lacquer screens and glamorous silk robes. But it was tea which drove the entire financing of the trade. It was the import of tea from China, in this case here it is being packed in Canton by Chinese, and in the front is a Western merchant negotiating for his shipload. It was that which drove the joint stock companies in the West to take on the risk that this trade generated every year. Every ship was funded by a joint stock fundraising effort. It was done on the basis that if you were lucky and your ship got back, there was a chance of making a very great deal of money. But quite a lot didn't get back. When they did get back, the first thing that got sold was the tea. Because in the 18th century particularly, and from about 1700 onwards really, tea was becoming the staple temperance drink of Western Europe. That's its great importance, ladies and gentlemen. When it began to be imported, along with chocolate and along with coffee, of course, these became drinks which no longer required essentially on alcohol or water. They provided something which Westerners at every level of society could drink for pleasure and for a certain amount of benefit, because all three of them, being caffeine enriched, gave you a bit of a lift as well. Tea came back in two forms, and the profitability of the trade again rose and fell depending when the cargoes got back, because tea was either sent back green. This pair of wonderful South Staffordshire glass tea caddies demonstrate the difference. It either came back as green tea, that is to say unroasted tea, and that had to be got back very quickly, because the point of roasting tea was to make it survive longer. So if your ship could get back quickly and your tea could be sold as green, there was often a premium on green tea. It was fresher, it had more flavour, but of course it was much more fragile, much easier to roast the teas out there to create the black teas, the ones that we're all most familiar with these days. The black teas, which came from the hills in an area called Bohia in Fujian province, hence the name which came over to Europe of Bohia teas or black teas. These became available in vastly greater quantities during the 18th century, because of course it was much less of a risk to send back roasted teas, which had a much longer longevity, in sealed containers, than it was to send them back as green teas, which always had the potential to deteriorate during the 3-month trip back. So tea is absolutely commercial. What could you bring along though? The great trouble with tea is, of course, it doesn't weigh very much. It's immensely fragile, so you can't put it down below the water level in a boat. It has to be up somewhere near the top so that no water can get near it. The other commodities you're bringing back from China are also mostly pretty fragile and have the potential to deteriorate. Spices, of course, pepper, cinnamon, mace, nutmeg. Silk, of course, immensely popular and immensely expensive in the West, but also immensely fragile to ship. What the Western merchants in the 17th century, particularly the Dutch and British ones, had to find was something which would weigh down a boat on the way back, because every boat needed weight, but with a bit of luck you'd actually sell when you got back to the West. And what did they choose? Of course, they chose Chinese porcelain. This is a view across the warehouse in Amsterdam in 1986, when I was selling the Nanking cargo. It was a Dutch merchant ship that arrived home 230 years late. But it finally got home, nearly 200,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain, fresh from the seabed, from a ship which had sank on January the 10th, 1752. And it gave us a completely unprecedented way in which we could look at the China trade. And we could see the sheer volume of utility, functional objects that were coming back on a commercial cargo. Porcelain was wonderful for the East India companies, the Dutch company, the Swedish company, the British, the Scandinavian companies, Denmark and Sweden. It was the great thing was being low down in the boat. It provided the weight you wanted, and it was also virtually undamageable. Of course, it could get broken. There was perhaps a 5% wastage rate, but it didn't get damaged in the least by seawater. And that's what made it immensely popular. And the Chinese produced more and more as they saw a market for it, and as Westerners saw a market for it. The whole development in drinking tea in the West was completely, intimately associated with the evolution of the trade in Chinese porcelain, and particularly the trade in utility wares, tea wares for drinking tea, dinner services, as social behaviour moved on away from small family gatherings into something more corporate, and a way in which it reflected a move away from the earliest use of porcelain, where it was much more aristocratic and much more ambassadorial, presentational level, into something which was used on a completely daily basis during the 18th century. The Dutch marked this change. Here we have a painting of about 1640, painted by a Haarlem artist called Peter Claes. It was one of that group of vanitas paintings that the Dutch became so popular in Holland in the mid-late 17th century. Gave you the chance to show off your considerable wealth as a burgher, while at the same time supporting supposedly the principle of Protestantism, particularly in somewhere like Haarlem. This vanitas painting marks a transitional moment. It's a moment when Chinese porcelain is coming out. You can see on the right-hand side that wonderful large dish, dating to about 1610, 1620, in a painting of 1640. So it's a couple of decades old. It's being used as decoration, but it's part of an assemblage. It is not just there for decoration on a wall or on the crack shelf. It's there because it's being used, putting fruit in. The Dutch were beginning to import porcelain in the 1620s, 30s, 40s in sufficient volume to be able to use it not merely as something which marks your status, but as something which was actually functional. It was unprecedented in the West. And that's why porcelain does form such a part of my talk today, because by virtue of being not subject to any deterioration, it was the only element in the China trade, really, which could be imported in huge quantities and was wildly popular, from the most aristocratic, grandest house down to a local merchant in Scotland or in Wales, where much of it is still found today. This taste for Chinese objects didn't just emerge overnight as a taste for functional ones. There was a long tradition in late 16th and early 17th century Europe of a fascination with the vision of Cathay. Nothing, of course, was known about it. There were a certain number of printed books being produced by Dutchmen based on drawings and indeed by Spanish and Portuguese, but none of them gave a very accurate view of Asia. And this vision of Cathay dominated the European perception for 300 years, really only until the introduction of photography, when photographers like Felix Beato were going out to Asia in the 1850s, 1860s, and bringing back actual photographs of what the place and the people really looked like. So where Western view was dominated by people like John van der Bank Sr., producing something with a Chinese element, in this case one of the famous tapestries, the so-called Soho tapestries, but in fact produced actually in Holborn at the Great Wardrobe Studio in Great Queen Street, where he and a number of workers from the Royal Mortlake factory had moved in the 17th century to recreate these spectacular tapestries, which are such an important part of interior decoration during the late Renaissance and early Baroque period. So Van der Bank's tapestry set the tone for what people thought of Asia, sort of whimsical, odd, mysterious, quite practical in some ways, but based on very, very little practical evidence. It was that made Chinese porcelain so popular at the time to these people fascinated by the chinoiserie vision as well. And one man in particular got hooked by it, a man called Daniel Marot. Daniel Marot was a Dutchman. He was a Frenchman, but he'd escaped to Holland. He was a Protestant. He got out in 1685 after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes had forced many Protestants to flee, some going to Switzerland, some coming to the UK, and quite a lot going to Holland to join the court of the Stadtholder of Orange. That's where Daniel Marot headed off for. But unlike many of the manufacturers who went to the Protestant countries around France, he was an architect, and he began to create designs which merged this fascination among the Dutch or the Dutch provinces with Chinese porcelain, which had been arriving for 60, 80 years, with his own interest in interior decoration. And what he created was this new vision of Cathay, where porcelain was massed. It was the ability to acquire large quantities of Chinese imported porcelain, but then to use it to decorate a room, which Marot introduced to Western interior design, and which still has a place today. When I was selling the Nanking cargo, people were buying 1,000 pieces, lots of 1,000 pieces, to do up a room in the same way as Daniel Marot was suggesting one should do a room in the 1690s. This porcelain all comes from a shipwreck I sold, which dates to about 1690, so it's all Kangxi period porcelain, mid-Kangxi period. Export porcelain, not very distinguished in its own right, but when it's put together into an interior like this, in fact Nina Campbell designed this for us, when it's put together into an interior, it looks absolutely splendid. And when you're comparing it with the previous typical Baroque interiors of Western Europe, it added a brightness to the room. it shimmered at night. It was fantastic under candlelight. And that's what immediately attracted the stadtholder of Orange to it. The palace at Het Loo was decorated. And then, of course, when William and Mary came to the UK in 1689, they turned Kensington Palace, or particularly Queen Mary turned Kensington Palace into a showcase for this sort of way of using porcelain. It was the ability to make up symmetrical sets, which was so interesting. The Chinese had no interest in symmetrical sets themselves at all. The only symmetrical set of vessels in China is a set of 5 vessels that stand on an altar. The 2 flower vases, 2 candlesticks, and an incense burner in the centre. They had no concept, and they still have no concept, of taking different shaped pieces and putting them together in symmetrical arrangements. Only in the West, people with architects and interior designers like Marrow and William Kent could one achieve this effect. And therefore, when Hogarth was painting the Mariage à la Mode, when we got on to item number 2 in this wonderful series of 6, the tête-à-tête after a particularly rough night for the unmarried, on the mantelpiece is carefully dressed with a symmetrical group of objects in a way that one would have used a set of 5 vases for. This reached its apogee really in Berlin, when in 1706 a new room was opened in the old palace in Berlin, the Charlottenburg Palace. It was the room of porcelain, the Porcelainzimmer, which it was and is an astonishing demonstration of the way in which blue and white porcelain and gilt-painted furniture and walls could create a room entirely on its own. If you go back to Dresden today, you will see in the palace there a way that's been recreated by a distinguished American architect and designer. This late 17th century effect, the way in which functional porcelain, which is being used for drinking tea, can also serve as a spectacular room decoration. But it wasn't just porcelain which came to Europe as works of art, as Western works of art for houses. Lacquer came. Lacquer was very popular with Western interior decorators from about the mid-17th century onwards. Here's some splendid chairs, which are actually in Ham House. They date from the late 17th century, and they are typical of the other commodities. Many of you would have seen the large, very large, so-called Coromandel screens, the great big black ground lacquer screens, which are a staple of many 18th century Palladian country houses still today. They were splendid exports from China, which the Westerners had got no ability to create on the same scale. Furniture, lacquered furniture was popular. Mirror paintings were wonderful. Porcelain, everything which enabled you to raise the mood, to brighten up a room away from the sort of typical panelling of a grand late Baroque room. Anything which enlivened the atmosphere was popular. And if you decided actually you really still liked the designs a lot, but you preferred the Western designs incorporated into Chinese wood, you could make a magnificent pair of chairs like these. These are made from Chinese rosewood. They're based on a Western design from about 1720, and they came back as part of a set of 12 for somebody who actually felt it was worthwhile waiting a year and a half to have his set of chairs made in China, presumably having sent out a model, than it was to have one made in one of the cabinet makers in St Martin's Lane or in the West End of London in the 1720s and 30s. It was remarkable that how routine it was becoming to actually commission your works of art to be made in China in a taste that you particularly liked. One of the most important ones was wallpaper. Again, it's extraordinary that nobody in the West had really invented wallpaper. The Spanish had invented painted leather panelling, or hangings for walls. Tapestries, of course, Mortlake tapestries in the UK, Beauvais, Savonnerie ones in France were popular. But the concept of wallpaper was a great novelty in 18th century Europe. It added a rather feminine touch to a room. And so much of these Chinese works of art made for Europe do have a feminine quality, whether it's porcelain, the small-scale porcelain, the very fact that tea itself is giving the ladies in a household a much greater social status and social standing. They can entertain themselves, their own friends, without having to follow a sort of masculine route of serving alcohol. And wallpaper, once again, as you'll see if you go to Osterley Park, it immensely brightens up a room Panelling obviously is far, far darker, but even a big tapestry or a leather wall hanging, a dark and heavy, pompous, beside the leavening, brightening effect that hand-painted Chinese wallpaper could produce for a room. It looked good, of course, if it was set behind a piece of appropriate furniture, in this case a Chinese Chippendale cabinet, which contains a slew of Chinese export porcelain, and standing in its rather grand Palladian house in front of a wall of painted Chinese papers. That's the effect of a house like Osterley. It was a revolutionary look, but it was a very amusing. It was a very amusing feel. It was whimsical. There were funny things going on if you look carefully at the designs. The birds were doing amusing things, and people were behaving in sort of slightly strange ways, like the Van der Bank tapestry showed so well. It was an imagination. Very little of this was based on any sort of actual knowledge of what was happening at all in China itself. Who were the merchants who were bringing this all back? How did this stuff get back? How was the trade organised? Well, they were organised by supercargoes. Supercargoes were men attached to, or a man in some cases, attached to every single boat that went out from the west, and given the responsibility, the considerable responsibility, of handling the funds of the joint stock company who had sent the boat out. This is a supercargo. Many of them, well not many, but a certain number of them, had their figures copied by by Chinese plasterers in Western style, and they were called face makers. This is a face maker's model, almost certainly carved and painted in Canton in about 1730, showing the supercargo, normally quite often good commercial negotiators who'd come out to buy the teas and haggle with the Chinese and then deal with the Indians when you stop en route back to buy Indian chintzes and the other Indian commodities. So men who had a big responsibility on their shoulders but came back with a very tangible souvenir of their time in China, their face maker's model. I stress that the effect of Chinese works of art was to lighten up a room, to leaven the atmosphere of a rather heavy, dark Baroque interior. And nothing did this better than Chinese glass paintings. What is amusing is that many of these are, as many of you will know, these are painted from behind onto sheets of mirrored glass. You carve away the silvering to leave areas, and then you paint from behind to create these extraordinary designs. What's interesting about these is that very often they're actually painted by the Chinese on Western glass mirrored sheets. And there's, again, an entirely commercial and profitable logic to this. The Chinese love mirrors. They couldn't make good ones. They couldn't make good glass themselves. The Vauxhall glass, the Western glass, is much thicker than anything the Chinese could make in the 18th century. And so there was a big market in China for what used to be called Vauxhall glasses, for these large mirrors sent out on the East India Company ships. The great problem was, though, like so many other things, these are fragile. And sea air, and particularly salt water, do immense damage to the silvering on mirrors. So what you do is, when you get your mirrors to Canton, you unload them, you see which ones have survived the journey and flog those to your Chinese commissioner, or trade commissioner. And then the ones which have been damaged in transit, you hand over to a painter in Canton. He scrapes off the damaged area of silvering on the back of the mirror, paints these spectacular paintings in reverse, whacks them onto the next boat, and they come back to Europe, where they form the centrepiece of great chinoiserie rooms, or indeed in some cases are even incorporated into furniture, like this splendid pair of matched mirrors which have now been incorporated into a Chinese Chippendale cabinet. A brilliant example of the way in which the East India Companies never missed a trick on turning a profit. And indeed that was always the keynote of the trade, whether it was fans that were being shipped back, whether it was textiles like silk, whether it was Canton lacquer, in this case tea boxes. You know, if you've got your tea, your Chinese tea, and you've got your Chinese porcelain to serve it from, why not keep it in a Chinese lacquer tea caddy as well? The China trade spawned a relatively few number of objects. They did come back in very great quantities, particularly fans. Hundreds of thousands of fans came back in the last decades of the 17th century. There was a complete vocabulary of how to use your fan in Restoration Britain. Books were written about the way in which you unfolded your fan at an event, the way you held it up or down, the way in which it was used to initiate conversations or no doubt to conclude conversations. And so fans were an important part of polite society in late 17th and early 18th century Britain, and they were also an important part of the East India Company ships. But it was all fanciful, it was all based on imagination. Nobody really knew what on earth China looked like. Nobody knew what Chinese objects really looked like. All they could judge was from things which were created by the Chinese but came back because they suited a certain Western sort of taste. And even the illustrations of the time were unrealistic. Here we are, this is a view of packing porcelain in Jingdezhen. Jingdezhen was the porcelain capital of China for nearly 1,000 years. And there it was that the big cargoes were created in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pieces to be packed up and taken overland 300 miles back to the port of Canton, where they were sold in shops where the Westerners would go to buy sufficient quantities to fill up the holds or the kentlage of their ships going back to Europe. But this is all complete imagination. They're entirely fanciful, even though they're actually painted by the Chinese themselves in China in 1800, 1820. They're entirely fanciful views of what was a much more difficult, and certainly in the case of Jingdezhen, a much more unpleasant industrial context. Nevertheless, they filled the same sort of demand. They filled the demand for creating a context of elegance, of chic behaviour, of polite society, which is why they sold so well in the bazaars of India. This is about 1830, where new porcelain is being sold to the Indian aristocracy and upper classes, the colonial administration in India, and back in London as well in the grand shops along Jermyn Street and up Old Bond Street as it was then before New Bond Street got built. So porcelain is the keynote of this trade in terms of the Chinese works of art that came back. The Chinese, of course, were fascinated by porcelain themselves, and they of course invented it. But they were much more interested in the certain sorts of porcelain made in domestic tastes. And it's the change away from domestic taste into a taste much more suited to Westerners, which drives the whole fascination in Europe with tea, with drinking tea, and with furnishing your house with grand vases and garnitures and dinner services. The Chinese also were interested in the Westerners. We took surprisingly little interest in finding out what they really looked like, and the Chinese took the same attitude. The difference was that in the West, we thought the Chinese were pretty civilized and sophisticated. In Asia, the Chinese thought that Westerners, they could only judge from a bunch of profiteering supercargoes and ships crews. They took perhaps a rather less exalted view of what Westerners were really like. This wonderful little imperial vase was made for the Chenlong Emperor in the middle of the 18th century to demonstrate what they thought Westerners looked like, obviously derived from a Western print of the time. But porcelain, for the Chinese, porcelain had always been a component of the export trade. Ever since 1351, when the first documentary piece of blue and white was made, it was blue and white essentially which fueled the trade, first of all with the Near East, the Middle East, and then with Europe. Blue and white was immensely popular again for one completely commercial reason, which is of course that porcelain only has to be fired once in a kiln if it's painted in underglazed blue. You throw your piece of pottery or porcelain, you let it dry, you then paint the design on it in ground up cobalt, the so-called cobalt blue. You then let that dry, dip the whole thing in a bucket of glaze and put it into the kiln and fire it at one time, very high temperatures, 1300 degrees. And when it comes out, if you're lucky, you've got the finished product. You don't have to paint any other colours over the surface. And by only firing it one time, this was an enormous commercial benefit for the Chinese. And it meant they could turn out lots and lots of porcelain at the highest level, but by cutting down on the manufacturing costs and only firing it one time, they focused attention on blue and white, and it was that which we began to see most often in the West from a very early date. This piece was sent off to the court of Shah Jahan in the 16th century. This piece came back to Europe in about right at the end of Elizabeth's reign, and by about 1600 it had been mounted in European silver gilt but it was still something for a treasury. For the Chinese, it was very ordinary porcelain, but they knew Westerners liked blue and white, so off it went to be shipped abroad. For the Westerners, this was still a trophy object, and at the time, Henry VIII only had 6 pieces of Chinese porcelain. Elizabeth had a certain number, and this piece here, say, surviving from the very end of the 16th century, shows that there was still a fascination with this sort of material. The Chinese were interested in Westerners, but not sufficiently interested to actually create much to do with them. For the Westerners, however, it was very amusing to recreate in Chinese pieces, particularly in porcelain, things which they were familiar with, but again were whimsically Chinese. A good example here, this porcelain is made in Fujian province, where the Bohea Hills are, where the tea comes from. They were trading from there in the late 17th century, and these pieces made for the export market in about 1680, 1690, 1700, made showing Westerners gathered slightly pointlessly around a table, the family, with the father and the son with their tricorn hats. Objects which came back during a great flush of interest in Blanc de Chine porcelain. It was Blanc de Chine in the late 17th century which was the closest competitor to blue and white for popularity in Europe, and people furnished entire rooms with Blanc de Chine. It was the same reason really as blue and white was. If it was contrasted with rich Western style decorations, it formed a brilliant display. This splendid room, created in about 1720, using just the most ordinary white porcelain from China, the so-called Blanc de Chine, but set in glamorous surrounds, which, in the context of early 18th century interior decade, was radically different, just like the Charlottenburg Palace was. Something that had never been seen before, done before, even imagined before by architects, because the material simply wasn't available. And if you couldn't find contemporary pieces of porcelain for the French, you just took anything that was available. Here, a spectacular 14th century Celadon jar, shipped back to Europe, given to one of the Marchands Mercier in Paris in about 1740 or 1750. No respecters of antiquity. The French then lopped off the finial on the vase, on the cover, because they felt presumably it was a bit too boring if it's just a pear-shaped finial, and put on these amazing mounts onto an object which is a pure piece of 14th century Chinese export porcelain, made in a taste which had long since disappeared, but to a Frenchman was something which was still immensely exciting and exotic, fit to dress the grandest of hôtels de ville in metropolitan Paris. Slightly smaller scale, but again all ornamented. Fairly standard Chinese export porcelain, made between about 1670 and 1730, but all mounted in Europe one way or another with ornamented bases or put together in little groups, things which would dress a sideboard, things which would give a note of chicness, of sophistication to an 18th century drawing room, and very much things which were female taste. All of them rather elegant, rather delicate, things which would dress a lady's drawing room, as they began to be formally known in the early 18th century, and would interest her guests as they sat around sipping their bohea from their blue and white tea bowls and saucers. What one needed, of course, for all this Chinese porcelain, or all these Chinese works of art, was a new context in Europe where people could explore things, and that's exactly what was happening in late 17th century and early 18th century Europe. This is Harwood House. After the restoration of 1660, a whole new generation of rich, either agricultural-based aristocrats or successful city merchants in the City of London were beginning to make very large amounts of money, and that huge boom in Neo-Palladian mansions and villas from about 1670 onwards gave interior designers the perfect opportunity to use these Chinese products in a way which moved away from the austere traditions of late medieval Europe. Initially, it was Japanese art. Japanese porcelain was coming over. During the mid-17th century in China, there was a civil war, but by about 1690, the civil war was over, and the kilns were furnishing again the demands of the East India companies. But from about 1670 to about 1700, 1720, There was a big vogue in these grand new Palladian mansions in Europe for Japanese export pieces of large scale. The scale was the important thing. Again, a match sets of vases and jars, and in a way that had never been done by the Asians themselves, either Japanese or Chinese, but things which dressed a magnificent new interior. Pieces which looked absolutely splendid in grand houses, as they do here in Chiswick House, built in 1726 by the third Earl of Burlington. Pieces which are of a scale for these new mansions, not sort of small bits that were just used for everyday purposes. These were pieces to really impress people when they came to visit you. But as I say, the Japanese effect was only a fairly short period, because after the civil wars of the mid-17th century in China, the Chinese recovered very quickly, and they too discovered their ability to create massive pieces of porcelain as well as the smaller ones. And during the late 17th and the whole of the 18th century, the production of display pieces in China for the export market was perhaps the most exciting of all the areas. Either you bought things that were off the shelf, like a huge dish like this or a vase before, or increasingly you could commission your own pieces. And that was a really fun way to do it. Rather than going to Thomas Good in South Audley Street, you would actually go to one of the ship's merchants in the city, in Exchange Alley, which is where they used to gather for several weeks before a ship went off, and they took orders there from the general public who wanted to have services made, they wanted to have sets of chairs made, and there the supercargoes would gather and the ship's captains would gather, and they would produce samples. They would produce sample vessels. And you could say, okay, I'd like one with grisaille oak leaves around the top, and I'd like my medallion in 4 different places. And what you then did was to send out your coat of arms. So it was a very straightforward system. And what was absolutely amazing was that it worked so brilliantly. The Chinese had no idea what they were doing when a Westerner said, I want a mug in this shape. Here's a brass example, or sent out a brass example. And here's my coat of arms on my book plate. These are the colours I want you to paint it. And miraculously, the system worked. When the supercargoes got to Canton, they obviously sat down with the Canton-based merchants and said, okay, we want a set of vases or a set of mugs or a dinner service like this. In this case, Baron Trevor of Bromham, who got married in 1704, had obviously celebrated this happy event by commissioning a dinner service of a particular spectacular quality. This chap, a Scottish magnate, commissioned something even grander and bigger as a display piece with his coat of arms in about 1720. This is a copy of a Monteith, a silver piece, made or used in the days when you didn't actually cool the wine that you were serving. You cooled the glasses in a huge bucket of ice. The glasses are hung over the edge of the vessel. You can see one on the right-hand side of the photograph with its foot upright. And then the wine was served to you as you sat at table in your chilled wine glass. But it wasn't just great aristocrats who commissioned these pieces. In the City of London, there was a whole new generation of financiers who were making a great deal of money. One of them was a small, largely unknown man called Leek Oakover, who did exactly like everybody else. He sent out his very grand coat of arms, newly granted, to China in the early 1730s, and back came his service. He lived in Rutland. This is a completely unknown squire in Rutland would end up with a dinner service from China looking like this. It was an astonishing business. Even in the City of London, a rather distinguished financier who'd been trained in Holland and was working at the Bank of England had his own service made. He had got married in 1727, and in about 1730, my distinguished forebear Alexander Sheaf sent out his bookplate to have his own service made, of which a few bits have survived in a distinguished London private collection. It was just the thing you did. Alexander had his service, but so did dozens of others of his compatriots in London. You can actually mark the emergence of successful financiers and South Sea company directors and bankers by the dates in which their services were commissioned. And there's a wonderful book by David Howard about Chinese armorial porcelain, where he lists over 6,500 services which were made during the 18th century on the same basis, decide how big you want your service to be, whether it's a coffee service, a tea service, a dinner service, a set of vases, hand over your book plate and deposit, and 18 months later, back it'll come from China, if you're lucky. But it wasn't just coat of arms. You could also commission silver shapes. For example, a Dutch draftsman called Cornelis Pronk was commissioned between 1734 and 1738 to produce designs for the Dutch East India Company, and he took his designs from shapes available to him, in this case rather splendid silver wine cooler shapes, and also Japanese designs. So the ladies who are painted on here are based on a Japanese prototype rather than the Chinese one. It was a great mixture of original design, which could be sent out to China to create again something whimsical and amusing in a taste you understood, but which bore no resemblance to the Chinese manufacturers who actually put these together. Even political events could be commemorated. Here, some Dutchman, possibly who'd actually survived the South Sea folly of the early 1720s, commissioned a set of satirical prints from Holland to be painted onto Chinese porcelain and sent back as a memento of a lunatic period when John Law managed to lose large numbers of investors a very great deal of money. I rather look forward to the Chinese set of dinner plates commemorating Bitcoin. Had you been a ship's captain, what was a more dramatic souvenir of your trip to China than a picture showing where you've been based for several months in your own factory or waterfront hong at Canton? In this case, again, the British and the Dutch next door to each other, as they were for several hundred years, in their trading upstairs on those rather comfortable verandas. The Westerners are taking the air, and downstairs, the locked warehouses are where the commodities were kept as they were put together over a long period of time, over the 3 months before being shipped downriver on those little boats I showed you, 13 miles down to where your merchant ship, your East India Company boat, was lying at wait in Whampoa anchorage. Those of you who are familiar with London will recognise both the scenes on this splendid bowl here. This was commissioned obviously by a man who's a trustee of, or certainly a supporter of, 2 different organisations in London. He obviously spent time, or perhaps indeed was a trustee of the Foundling Hospital, which is the building shown at the top, taken from a print. The Foundling Hospital opened for orphans by Thomas Coram in 1739, an organisation of which William Hogarth was a trustee, and some of his greatest paintings are still housed there. And down below, a slightly more rumbustious image, an image of Vauxhall Gardens, opened in 1660 when it was known as New Spring Gardens. This is a man who is a Londoner through and through. He decided he wanted to commission a grand, very large punch bowl. He sent out 2 colour prints of 2 of the places with he was best associated. I'd love to know who this was made for. But it does encapsulate the way in which the China trade could respond to Western demand and could produce totally mesmeric objects, which when they came back to Europe were unlike anything else that was available, either in the scale or in the quality. This is probably made about 10 years before Chelsea's red anchor and gold anchor period, and that was the closest one could get in Britain to glamorous Chinese porcelain. The sort of wares which the Chelsea factory, Nicholas Fremont's factory, were producing, despite getting systematically bust on a regular basis. Yeah, it's so much easier to send out your prints to China, have a large-scale piece, perfectly fired, not warped, made of high-quality resonant porcelain, and brilliantly hand-painted with 2 scenes very familiar to you. It's about decoration. That's what makes Chinese export objects so fascinating. They're there to cheer up a room, cheer up a dining table in this case. Here's a goose tureen. It's obviously made to serve some sort of stew, meat stew probably, but it was partly functional, partly highly decorative. Again, something which no factory, with the possible exception of a very few at Chelsea, would ever attempt to make, as the sheer technical complexities. For the hunting, fishing, shooting community, a pair of King Charles Spaniels perhaps would look amusing on the mantelpiece. If you were a much more hunting type, a pair of silver-shaped candlesticks with a pair of hounds flanking them as something to amuse your colleagues in the country as you came back from the hunt. And if you couldn't quite afford the latest model in silver shape for your dining table, why not send out a drawing or a print and have the Chinese make you a set of candlesticks in shapes which were appropriate and smart and up to date, but weren't quite as expensive. Ladies and gentlemen, the China trade had this immensely civilizing effect on the West. But it wasn't as easy as perhaps I made it sound. It was a dangerous, risky, but potentially a highly profitable business. These joint stock companies could be extremely profitable if your ship came home first with its cargo of tea, but hugely expensive if it foundered en route, as very many did, particularly coming around the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Good Hope. Nevertheless, the ships that brought back sufficient quantities to have a quite extraordinary and unprecedented effect on Western society in the 17th and 18th century. I've tried to show you, therefore, today the things I outlined at the beginning, how, from the earliest years of the 16th century, Western merchants discovered and began to fight among themselves and began to work out the complicated and dangerous trading routes to the alluring East. I've shown you how these attractive China trade objects entered the European luxury retail trade and how they greatly influenced social behaviour and interior decoration in Europe at both aristocratic and very often at much lower, very middle-class social levels as well. And I hope I've shown you again how these very commercial maritime associations with Asia, established by the monopolist East India companies, permitted an unprecedented assimilation of Asian arts and crafts into Western interior design. I hope, therefore, that some of the 18th century sense of whimsical fascination and combined with commercial practicality, how this 18th century fascination with real objects coming from exotic lands, from the vision of Cathay, has been recaptured for you today. Thank you very much.